wore the badge of sheriff in the old Southwest was generally the most important man in town.
Walt Disney was peculiarly poised between the past and the future. He loved experimentation. He loved cutting-edge technology.
Walt was a man who always wanted to do something new, and new was important to him.
But he was very interested in the past.
There are figures who fit into our sort of our frontier mythology.
I think he really had a good feeling for the roots of America.
Myths are the stories we tell that explain our world to ourselves.
The history is a lie agreed upon. Disney was very canny at picking people who were very colorful and very exciting figures, but also incredibly positive figures. If Walt Disney had opted only to stick with fairy tales, I wonder what would have happened to an entire generation of kids.
Each week as you enter this timeless land, one of these many worlds will open to you.
Walt started looking into television about a good 5 years or so before anything actually got onto the air. There were not that many families that had television sets. He didn't feel that the market was really there yet until the real need for financing for Disneyland came along. That was his real impetus to finally take the plunge, take advantage of what he had learned, and jump into television. His brother Roy wasn't convinced that this was a good idea, so Walt was a real big believer in putting your money where your mouth is. Then, finally, Roy decided that there was some merit in following up with the television idea. They went to the premier network, CBS and NBC, got turned down by both of them. And finally, in a sort of act of desperation, they went to ABC and said, look, we'll do a TV show for you if you will put money into the Disneyland park. So they signed a deal to come up with a TV show, and the whole market was very different than it is today. If you wanted to get a show in the air, your basic way at that time was to go to an ad agency, link up with them, and they would produce it. Walt was extremely reluctant to do that. He wanted to control his product. He didn't want to be in a position where somebody else told him what to do. What he really saw was television as an advertising medium. Why would somebody go to a Disney movie instead of some other studio? Maybe because they saw something on television that interested them.
Walt Disney presents.
When Walt first launched the TV show, he wanted some very strong identification between Disneyland the series and Disneyland the theme park. It was announced with ABC that the show would be about the same lands at Disneyland, Adventureland, Tomorrowland, Frontierland. But then when Walt got back to the studio and people started asking him how he was going to do that, he said, frankly, I don't know. Adventureland would be shows of African adventurers. Going into Tomorrowland, that was the tough one to do. He got into Frontierland, and you're looking at this cornucopia, scenes of the Old West and how America got to be the country that it was at that time. What's the first thing you do, and how do you start?
Walt Disney originally wanted to do a series of films and then TV shows on figures from American folklore. And I think he first wanted to do Johnny Appleseed.
And there's a famous story about how he didn't know which one to pick, and at the luck of the draw, he picked Davy Crockett.
And an interesting thing happened. They didn't concentrate on folklore Crockett. They instead concentrated on the real Davy. And that, interestingly, I think, turned out to be the pattern for all these subsequent shows.
He did things that other studios just wouldn't have done. Namely, he went on location to do this, and he did it in color. But he went off to Tennessee and filmed it on location where these things actually occurred at tremendous expense. He didn't know if he had any particular way to ever recoup this investment. I mean, if you're going to be showing in black and white and your entire audience is in black and white, why on earth go to the extra expense of shooting in color? Well, Walt's had a vision for the future. Color would come to television sooner or later.
They say the best man is one of the volunteers, name of Crockett.
Well, where is he?
As a matter of fact, General, he's out hunting.
By the eternal, I want this Crockett fellow and I want him right now. Fetch him.
The first Davy Crockett show was in December of 1954. Davy Crockett Indian Fighter. And Disney planned it just to be 3 shows. Soon after that first episode, the subject swept the nation. The market became flooded with items based on Davy Crockett.
Some of Walt's shows only aired once, and if you didn't see it that one time, you didn't see it again. You didn't want to go to school the next day and everybody talking about, gee, did you see what Davy did? That was really something. No, I was doing the dishes. So if you wanted to keep up with all the other kids, you did the same thing they did, which sit down in front of that TV at the right time.
Over 10% of children's clothes from 1955 were related to Davy Crockett. The song was recorded by, I think, 16 artists in that year, sold millions of copies.
The song was basically written to fill up a few minutes when the show came out short and they needed to pad it.
This all happened in 6 months. It was insane.
Disney and other studios try to capture the same magic, but trying to duplicate the Crockett mania is something that I think would be hard to do.
There was a definite fear that the raccoon was going to become extinct because they were slaughtering them by the tens of thousands to make these coonskin caps. And the end of the craze, their warehouses filled with coonskin caps that they couldn't give away because it stopped just like that. It was the first experience of the baby boom asserting itself as a marketing force. We want this is what we like, give it to us. And as slightly ashamed as I am to say it, we baby boomers have never changed very much from that. We've always seen ourselves as the center of the universe.
When the final episode of Davy Crockett aired, Walt had a real problem. He had the biggest runaway television hit of all time and a dead hero. He at first said that was it. I'm not going to go back and do anything else with Davy, but audiences really wanted it. The ratings did very well. When it was rerun, it did even better. It was rerun a third time the same season, it did even better. Even more amazingly, though, when it was put out in the theaters, people went to see it again a fourth time, paying for something they had already seen 3 times for free. Difference was this time they could see it in color. So Walt's foresight in shooting the shows in color really paid off.
Alfago Baca?
That's right.
We got your notice.
Yes?
So, we come to turn ourselves in.
Well, I'm glad to see you gentlemen see things my way.
When Walt was looking to create the first of the Western series, he had a whole host of ideas to look at.
Alfago Baca. What an interesting guy. Even more interesting than the TV show.
The real-life Alfago was on the other side of the law. People argued with Walt, why would you glamorize somebody who is an outlaw? He said, you know, anybody can start going in one direction. The fact that this man turned in another is important.
A lot of what the TV show suggests is true, and that standoff he had in the house happened.
With the concept picked to do Alfago Baca, the subject turned naturally enough to who's going to star in it. Walt came and announced a kid from Staten Island, New York, Robert Loggia, Italian-American, that was going to do this. People were sort of surprised. He was going to be playing a person of Mexican heritage, and it worked really well. Robert Loggia was just brilliant in the role, and I don't think too many people, when they saw it on TV, really knew that he was from Staten Island. Alfago Baca was initially supposed to be just 2 episodes. Walt went down and filmed this on location where some of the actual stories had taken place in New Mexico, which why go all the way to New Mexico if you could shoot it in the San Fernando Valley? He wanted the architecture, he wanted the actual churches and the buildings, and his feeling was to create them here, might as well go where the real ones were. As the series went on, though, he started taking the cost into account, so it led to the creation of the first Western sets back at the Disney studios. They spent a spectacular amount of money at the time. I think it was $400,000 to build an entire Western town for Alfago to have his exploits on. But the little 2-part throwaway episodes, again, big rating hit.
I think it's also worth mentioning that of these 6 or 7 Western and historical series that Walt Disney did, that 2 of them celebrate Hispanic heroes, Alfago Baca and Zorro. I think Walt has never gotten quite as much credit as he deserves for heading off in that direction as well.
We've got rangers from Connecticut, Virginia, Georgia, even a Scotsman.
Well, we never figured to have a Texan.
He's a Texan?
He doesn't talk loud enough.
The cowboy as this figure riding the open range, this solitary figure surrounded only by thousands of miles of open grasslands, is a figure that remains enormously powerful even today. And it really sort of speaks to the way in which we think of ourselves and we think of what is particularly important about the American character.
Walt had 2 successful Westerns on the air, and the network came back and said, we want another one. John Slaughter was a real member of the Texas Rangers. Tom Tryon, the actor who was eventually picked to play the part, Had to really have his arm twisted. I think he had done 3, maybe 4 movies at the time, and Walt did a lot of personal arm twisting to get him on board. The real John Slaughter was 5'5", Tom Tryon was 6'2". The real John Slaughter barely spoke a word to anybody. He preferred to make his statements with 6-shooters. Tom Tryon, very, very different. He later went on to a very successful career as a writer. It was a big hit. It was the longest running of all the Disney Westerns, and I can't sing, but the words were, "Texas John Slaughter made men do what they oughta, 'cause if they didn't, they died." Pretty simple, you know. I tell you, kids went to school every day singing those things.
Swamp Fox. That's what Tarleton called me, and I'm much obliged to him for the idea. We'll hold up here by day and we'll strike by night.
Francis Marion was a genuine Revolutionary War hero. You know, I'm a South Carolina native, and so Francis Marion is one of our state heroes.
The Swamp Fox hid in the marshes, popped out to fight the British, and went back and hid again.
There probably are people who are interested in history because they long to live in what they consider to be a simpler time. I got to tell you, the Revolutionary War doesn't seem simpler or easier to me.
Swamp Fox was another interesting casting situation that Walt had to deal with. He had been in deep negotiations with Audie Murphy, the World War II hero. Audie's people made a kind of tactical mistake and leaked the word to the press that Audie was a shoo-in for the role. I don't think that went over too well with the Disney faction, because all of a sudden Audie was out and in came Leslie Nielsen.
I would not watch Leslie Nielsen and the Swamp Fox as being a documentary on everything that he accomplished in the Revolutionary War. But what is in the shows, by and large, can be backed up by what is in the history books. Sure, they're simplified. Sure, they're streamlined. They're made as entertaining as they could be made, and there's a little song that you can sing along.
Swamp Fox, feather in his hat. No one knows where the Swamp Fox at.
But point by point, it matches with history fairly well. It's not completely off the track to watch that show and then read a biography of Francis Marion and find that it's a simple version, a Cliff Notes version, but fairly true. It's surprising the nuances that show up. His broken ankle, for instance, which is the reason he was not in Charleston when the British took over the city, because he broke his ankle jumping out of a window at a party, which is exactly what happens in the show. So he went home to mend and luckily was not captured when the British captured everybody else. So he goes off into the swamp and starts this guerrilla warfare. That's absolutely true. They added the theme song, which I don't think the real Swamp Fox had, but all Disney shows needed a theme song at that time.
Ready to listen to reason now, Red Stick?
I listen.
History is vitally important on many levels.
Davy Crockett don't lie.
The most obvious one is that you can't figure out what to do tomorrow if you don't know what happened yesterday. People who believe that the past is some sort of abstract thing that doesn't mean anything, that all that matters is now and the future, are going blindly into a future that they have no way of coping with and are making the same mistakes that people have made over and over. That being said, history is a real minefield and is a matter of interpretation. I think Disney was interested in celebrating American heroes, celebrating a kind of pureness of character, of bravery, of integrity. It certainly doesn't do a child any harm to have a figure of bravery, of honesty to look up to and to use as a guide for life. These figures who know what the right thing is and they do it. And that's what all these people have in common in the Disney TV shows.
We're neighbors here. Our lands join. You burn a man's house down from over his wife and children, he'll never forget that. He'll remember and he'll hate you till his dying day.
I love those moments when you can peek through the little crack in the wall of time. When it comes right down to it, all movies made about anything, past or present, are always firmly rooted in the time in which they're made. And that certainly goes for the Disney shows. These are all historical subjects and they're all delightful on their own level, but they're all clearly about the 50s.
What's more interesting is seeing what kind of vision and values are being projected backwards, and not so much what they reveal about the past as what they reveal about the present. It's interesting, even within the Disney world, to compare Walt Disney's 1950s versions of American history with that which came out under the Disney name in the 1990s as American history. Compare Davy Crockett as a heroic figure, what he represents, how he's portrayed, with Pocahontas as the most celebrated of American heroes or heroines in 40 years later in what Disney was putting out. What is it about Pocahontas that made her so sort of interesting in the 1990s? That she's a figure who brokers peace between Indians and the English colonists, as opposed to a kind of rough and rowdy frontier hero who shoots first and asks questions later, which is the old kind of celebrated Western hero. It may not tell us that much about either Pocahontas or Davy Crockett, but it tells us a great deal about the shifts in American culture that have occurred in the last 40 or 50 years.
I think, like most of us, there was a time in his life in which he absorbed most of the things that made him what he was. All of us have these things. There's a time when we're just sponges. And if we're lucky, good stuff is being sucked in. It's not history, it's something about history.
They give us a touchstone to begin a conversation about the past and its connections to the present.
Movies are best when they inspire. Walt Disney, he had a vast imagination and just a vast curiosity. He really saw more than most of us mortals see. He took his influence over America's children very seriously. He was an amazingly positive force on American culture, and these shows, they all had great lessons, great moral teachings, and they're still great fun.
The governor's Emmy, boy, what are you talking about?
I think in Disney's mind, what he thinks, this is what made America strong in the past, and this is what will make America strong in the future.
He was really down to earth. His shows were generally about people from small towns, humble beginnings, like Walt was himself. And it was something I think people could connect to and aspire, that, if some terrible wrong came to your city, maybe you could be the next Zorro and fight injustice.
Well, I'm talking sense, and you know it.
It all comes back to Davy. It all comes back to Walt Disney, Swamp Fox, Alfego Baca, and the rest would probably not have existed had Crockett not led the way. Everything flows from Walt. It's always Walt.